In the busy streets of Mushin, Lagos, Emmanuel Cole's life was full of frustration and hopelessness. Each day started the same way: the shouts of street hawkers selling their goods, the honking horns of Danfo speeding through chaotic traffic, and the distant sound of sirens cutting through the noise. By 5 a.m., he would already be awake, lying on his thin mattress in his one-room apartment, listening to church bells from the Catholic church mixing with the rumble of early morning trucks heading to the market and the calls of bread sellers walking through the narrow streets. The room he called home was small, with walls that had once been white but were now stained with the smoke from his neighbor's cooking fire. The morning sounds of Mushin would drift through his window, mothers shouting at children to prepare for school, the clatter of metal gates being opened for the day, and the sights of kerosene stoves as food vendors started preparing morning meals. Life in Mushin was tough for everyone, but for Emmanuel, it felt even harder. Nothing ever seemed to work out for him. He had tried everything: selling electronics, running a small barbershop, and even trying a music career. The electronics business failed when his supplier disappeared with his life savings. The barbershop went under when the landlord doubled the rent without warning. His music career ended before it began when the studio owner ran off with the money he had saved for recording his first song. But no matter how hard he worked or how much effort he gave, success always seemed just out of reach, slipping through his fingers like the grains of sand at Bar Beach. He would watch other young men his age driving nice cars, wearing expensive clothes, living the life he dreamed of, and wonder what secret they knew that he didn't. Emmanuel wasn't without talent. He had a deep, strong voice that made people stop and listen whenever he spoke. At the local bars where he sometimes went to forget his troubles, other customers would quiet down when he started talking, drawn in by the rich tones of his voice. His charm lit up any room he entered, making him the center of attention at parties and gatherings. Even the market women who usually shouted at everyone would soften their voices and give him extra pieces of meat in his soup when he stopped at their stalls. He had a special ability to read people, understand what they wanted, and tell them exactly what they needed to hear. This gift had saved him many times, like when his landlord came demanding rent and Emmanuel talked him into giving him an extra week to pay, or when angry customers at his failed businesses were ready to fight until he calmed them down with his smooth words and understanding smile. But in Lagos, talent and charm alone weren't enough to break free from poverty. Without money or connections, Emmanuel felt stuck in a never-ending cycle of struggle. He watched the rich getting richer in their big houses in Lekki and Ikoyi, while people in Mushin fought over scraps. Every morning, he would join the crowds fighting to get on overcrowded Danfo buses, breathing in the thick exhaust fumes, his clothes soaked with sweat before he even started his day. His mother had died when he was young, leaving him with memories of her soft voice singing hymns. His father worked as a security guard at a bank, coming home late every night with tired eyes and empty pockets. "Education is your way out," his father would say, but even after Emmanuel finished his first degree in business administration, the good jobs went to people who knew somebody who knew somebody. He would pray sometimes, asking God for a way out, for some kind of miracle that would lift him from this life of constant struggle. But God seemed as distant as the stars that could barely be seen through Lagos's hazy sky. What Emmanuel didn't know then was that his prayers were about to be answered, but not by any God he had ever prayed to before. His miracle would come with a price that would change his life forever. The evening that changed Emmanuel's life started like any other. He sat in a rundown bar near the Lagos Island docks, nursing a cheap beer he could barely afford. The bar wasn't much, just a dimly lit room with worn-out chairs and tables that wobbled. The walls were stained yellow from years of cigarette smoke, and old newspapers covered the broken parts of the windows. Around him, tired workers drank and talked in low voices, trying to forget their hard day's work. Emmanuel had spent his last money on this beer, thinking about all his failed dreams. His latest attempt at starting a small phone repair business had failed when his landlord doubled the rent without warning. Now he was back to zero, again. That's when he first heard them talking. At a corner table sat two people who looked like they didn't belong in this shabby place. The man, who Emmanuel would later know as Dr. James, wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Emmanuel made in a year. A gold chain hung heavy around his neck, and multiple red bracelets decorated his wrist. The woman, Sister Agnes, looked like she had just stepped out of a fashion magazine, with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes that seemed to shine even in the bar's dim light. Emmanuel wasn't trying to listen to their conversation, but something about their voices pulled him in like a magnet. They spoke quietly, but their words carried across the noisy bar like they were meant for his ears. "The circle gave me everything," Dr. James was saying, his fingers playing with one of his red bracelets. "You think this wealth came from hard work? Forget it. Power comes from knowing where to look." "But the sacrifices," the other man they were talking to said, his voice sounding scared and tormented. "Aren't they too much?" Sister Agnes leaned forward, her expensive perfume cutting through the bar's stale air. "Listen," she said, her voice smooth as honey but with a hidden edge. "Nothing worth having comes free. The bracelet does the hard work. You just need to follow some simple rules." Emmanuel found himself leaning closer, pretending to check his phone. His heart beat faster as he caught bits and pieces of their talk. They mentioned things that seemed impossible: instant wealth, power over others, miracles that defied explanation. But one phrase kept coming up: the Crimson Circle. As the night went on, Emmanuel watched Dr. James perform a small demonstration. When a drunk man accidentally spilled beer on Dr. James's expensive suit, instead of getting angry, Dr. James simply touched his bracelet and smiled. The drunk man's face went blank for a moment, then he pulled out his wallet and handed over everything he had, apologizing repeatedly. After the man left, Dr. James and Sister Agnes laughed, not even counting the money before tucking it away. That's when Emmanuel knew, whatever these people were involved in, whatever this Crimson Circle was, he wanted in. He needed this power, this escape from his endless struggle. As he walked home that night through Lagos's dangerous streets, his mind kept going back to those red bracelets and the promises they seemed to hold. What Emmanuel didn't know then was that he had stumbled upon something far older and darker than he could imagine. The Crimson Circle wasn't just some secret club for rich people, it was an organization with roots stretching back hundreds of years. The circle started during colonial times, when European traders first arrived on West African shores. These traders brought with them not just guns and goods, but secret knowledge from dark corners of Europe. They met with local secret societies, groups that had their own ancient magic and rituals. Instead of fighting, they decided to share their secrets. They mixed their knowledge together, creating something new and powerful: the Crimson Circle. Their headquarters looked like just another old colonial building in Ikoyi, Lagos. From the outside, it seemed abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows. But underneath were vast chambers where the circle performed their rituals. These underground rooms were built by slaves who never saw daylight again, their bodies buried in the very walls they constructed. The circle had a strict way of doing things. Members moved through different levels, like circles getting smaller and smaller. Each inner circle required bigger sacrifices but gave more power. The red bracelets were made from a special metal found only in certain sacred forests. Each bracelet contained a tiny piece of the ancient entity's power, a being so old it remembered when Lagos was nothing but swamp and forest. The entity that gave the circle its power wasn't evil, at least not in any simple way. It was like a force of nature, neither good nor bad, just hungry. It needed regular sacrifices to stay satisfied. The circle believed they were doing important work, keeping this hungry entity fed so it wouldn't cause bigger disasters. Every time someone disappeared in Lagos, every time a child went missing or a person vanished without trace, the entity grew a little stronger, and the circle's power grew with it. Dr. James had risen through many circles, which was why he wore multiple bracelets. Each one marked a major sacrifice he'd made, each one giving him more power but demanding more in return. Sister Agnes specialized in finding new members, using her charm and beauty to attract people who were desperate enough to do anything for success. The circle had branches all over the world, hidden temples in London, secret meeting places in New York, underground chambers in Dubai. But Lagos remained special. Something about the city's energy, its mix of ancient and modern, made the entity's power stronger here. The circle's members believed that Lagos itself was built on old magic, that the city's crazy energy and endless struggle for success made it perfect for their kind of power. They had rules that couldn't be broken. Once you joined a circle, you could only move inward, closer to the center where the real power was. Trying to leave meant death, not just normal death, but something worse. The entity would take back everything it had given, plus interest. That's why even members who had doubts, who were scared of what they were doing, kept going deeper instead of trying to escape. The circle kept detailed records of everything. Madame Sarah, the keeper of rituals, had journals going back centuries. These books told stories of great power and terrible prices paid. They recorded every sacrifice, every miracle, every time the entity's hunger was satisfied. The journals were written in many languages: English, French, Portuguese, Yoruba, Igbo, each telling part of the circle's long history. Brother Solomon, who would later train Emmanuel, had his own doubts about the circle. As a former soldier, he had seen enough death and understood the price of power better than most. But he stayed because he believed in order, in control. He thought it was better to have the entity's power controlled by the circle than letting it run wild. The building in Ikoyi where they met had many secrets. Behind its walls were rooms filled with treasures collected over centuries, ancient masks that held spirits, coins from lost kingdoms, books of forbidden knowledge. But the real treasure was in the deepest chamber, where the entity's presence was strongest. There, the air itself seemed alive, and the walls pulsed with a red glow that matched the bracelet's light. This was the world Emmanuel was about to enter, though he didn't know it yet. All he saw was a chance to escape poverty, to finally grab some of the success that had always slipped through his fingers. He didn't understand that in the Crimson Circle, every bit of power came with a price, and every miracle required a sacrifice. Emmanuel couldn't sleep that night after hearing about the Crimson Circle. He lay on his bed, listening to the sounds of Lagos at night, distant car horns, music from late-night parties, and the occasional shout from the streets below. The ceiling fan spun slowly, barely moving the hot air around. The next evening, he returned to the bar, hoping to see the two again. As luck would have it, they were there. His heart jumped when he saw them, Dr. James and Sister Agnes sitting at the same corner table, laughing and drinking as if they didn't have a care in the world. Taking a deep breath, Emmanuel walked over to their table. He practiced what he would say in his head with each step. When he finally stood before them, he put on his most confident smile. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't help but notice you both seem very successful. I want to learn your secrets. Can you teach me?" Dr. James and Sister Agnes looked at each other, sharing a smile that made Emmanuel feel like they had been expecting him. Sister Agnes's eyes seemed to look right through him, like she could read every desperate thought in his head. "Success isn't for everyone," Dr. James said, his gold chain glinting in the bar's dim light. "But if you're serious..." He paused, writing something on a paper. "Come to this address tomorrow at midnight. Come alone." The next night, Emmanuel found himself standing outside an old colonial building in Ikoyi. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the street darker than usual. The building looked abandoned, with broken windows and walls covered in climbing plants. For a moment, Emmanuel thought he had the wrong address. Then he saw them, Dr. James and Sister Agnes, standing in the shadows near the building's entrance. They wore long red robes now, not the expensive clothes from the bar. Without saying a word, they motioned for Emmanuel to follow them. They led him through a heavy wooden door that creaked loudly when it opened. Inside, the air felt different, cooler and thick with the smell of incense. They walked down several flights of stairs, going deeper underground. The only light came from old-fashioned torches on the walls, making their shadows dance like spirits. Finally, they entered a massive underground chamber. Emmanuel's eyes went wide as he took it all in. The room was circular, with walls made of smooth black stone. Hundreds of candles lit the space, their flames reflecting off golden symbols carved into the floor. About 30 people stood around the room's edges, all wearing red robes with their faces hidden under hoods. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, covered in strange carvings Emmanuel couldn't understand. Behind it stood an old man who seemed to command respect just by standing there, Chief Adenuga, the circle's leader. Next to him was a stern-looking woman writing in a thick leather book, Madame Sarah, though Emmanuel didn't know her name yet. "You stand at the edge of power," Chief Adenuga announced, his voice echoing in the large chamber. "But power has its price. Are you ready to pay it?" Emmanuel nodded, even though fear was creeping up his spine. The room felt alive somehow, like the walls themselves were breathing. He could hear whispers from the hooded figures, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Madame Sarah stepped forward, holding something that glowed red in the candlelight, a bracelet made of strange metal that seemed to pulse with its own light. "This is the seal of our covenant," she said, her voice both gentle and firm. "With it, you can heal the sick, call forth wealth, and bend others to your will. But remember, the bracelet binds you to us and to the entity we serve. Remove it, and everything it gives you will disappear. Break our rules, and the consequences will be severe." From the shadows, Brother Solomon watched carefully. The ex-soldier saw something familiar in Emmanuel, the same desperate hunger for power he had once felt himself. Solomon knew that hunger could be dangerous, but it could also make someone strong if properly guided. Emmanuel knelt before Madame Sarah, his heart beating so hard he thought everyone in the room must hear it. The stone floor was cold against his knees. His mouth felt dry as he watched her approach with the glowing bracelet. When the bracelet touched his skin, Emmanuel almost screamed. It felt like electricity shooting through his whole body. The room spun around him, and for a few seconds, he saw strange things, visions of ancient cities, shadows moving in darkness, and a huge, hungry presence that seemed to notice him for the first time. Then everything cleared. The bracelet felt warm against his wrist, like it had always been part of him. When he looked at it closer, he could see strange patterns in the metal, moving like tiny red rivers. "You are one of us now," Chief Adenuga said. "Brother Solomon will teach you our ways." Over the next few weeks, Emmanuel spent countless hours with Brother Solomon. They met in different places, abandoned warehouses, quiet corners of parks, empty churches late at night. Solomon was a tough teacher, but he knew what he was doing. "Power is like a weapon," Solomon would say, showing Emmanuel how to focus the bracelet's energy. "You need to respect it. Control it. Never let it control you." Emmanuel learned fast. Solomon taught him how to channel the bracelet's power into his voice, making people believe whatever he said. He learned how to touch someone and heal their sickness, though Solomon warned him that each healing took something from somewhere else. The bigger the miracle, the bigger the price. The entity must stay balanced, Solomon explained one night, as they sat in an empty church. If you heal someone's cancer, that same amount of suffering has to go somewhere else. The entity makes sure of that. Emmanuel also learned about the circle's rules. Never take off the bracelet. Never tell outsiders about the circle. Never refuse when the circle asks for a sacrifice. Breaking these rules meant death, or worse. Emmanuel rented an old warehouse with money Dr. James gave him. It was in a rough part of Lagos, with broken windows and graffiti on the walls. But Emmanuel had big plans for it. He spent 3 days cleaning it up, painting the walls, and setting up plastic chairs in rows. Above the door, he hung a sign, "Divine Light Assembly." Sister Agnes helped spread the word about the new church. She was good at finding people who were desperate, who would believe in miracles because they had nothing else left. She also planted some circle members in the congregation, people who would help make the miracles look real. On the first Sunday, about 20 people showed up. Most were curious neighbors or people Sister Agnes had invited. Emmanuel stood behind a wooden podium he had built himself, nervous but excited. The moment he started speaking, he felt the bracelet warm up on his wrist. His voice filled the warehouse, stronger and more powerful than ever before. He talked about hope, about miracles, about God's power to change lives. The circle members in the crowd shouted Amen, at all the right moments, getting the others excited too. Then came the first miracle. An old woman in the front row, carefully chosen by Sister Agnes, suddenly clutched her chest and fell down. People gasped. Someone screamed. Emmanuel walked calmly to where she lay. He placed his hand on her forehead, feeling the bracelet pulse with power. "Be healed," he shouted, and the whole room felt charged with energy. The woman's eyes opened. She sat up slowly, looking around in amazement. "The pain," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's gone. I can breathe properly for the first time in years." Of course, what the crowd didn't know was that somewhere else in Lagos, a healthy person had suddenly developed chest pains. The entity always kept its balance. Word spread fast after that. Next Sunday, the warehouse was full. Emmanuel performed more miracles, healing the sick, making the lame walk, even promising prosperity to those who gave money to the church. Within months, Divine Light Assembly had grown so big they had to look for a bigger building. But with each miracle, the entity's hunger grew. Dr. James started visiting more often, always with new demands from the circle. Small sacrifices at first, money from the church offerings, information about rich members, simple things. Emmanuel told himself it was worth it. Success finally felt real. Grace walked into Emmanuel's life on a hot Tuesday afternoon. She came to help organize a community outreach program, feeding poor children in the neighborhood. Emmanuel noticed her right away. Unlike the other volunteers who were there to be seen, Grace actually cared about helping people. What Emmanuel didn't know was that Sister Agnes had chosen Grace carefully. "We need someone clean," she had told Dr. James. "Someone with a good reputation who can make the church look legitimate." But even the circle's careful planning couldn't predict how Grace would change everything. Grace was different from the usual people around Emmanuel. She asked tough questions. When money went missing from church accounts, she investigated instead of looking the other way. When people talked about midnight meetings in the church, she made notes. She was smart, organized, and most dangerously for the circle, she couldn't be bought. Emmanuel offered her a job as his assistant, thinking he could control her better that way. Grace accepted, but not for the reasons he thought. She had seen something odd about Divine Light Assembly, how people who questioned Emmanuel seemed to disappear, how some miracles seemed too perfect, almost staged. Dr. James watched all this from the shadows. He saw Grace as useful, her presence made the church look better to outsiders. But Brother Solomon wasn't so sure. He recognized something in Grace that worried him, the same questioning spirit that had almost made him leave the circle years ago. As Divine Light Assembly grew bigger, the circle's demands grew darker. Emmanuel found himself called to more midnight meetings in the underground chambers. Each time, Chief Adenuga looked older, more tired, but his eyes burned with strange fire when he spoke about the entity's hunger. "The balance must be kept," Chief Adenuga would say, his voice echoing in the dark chamber. Greater power requires greater sacrifice. The sacrifices got worse. It wasn't enough anymore to just take money or information. The entity wanted more. Sister Agnes started marking certain church members, usually people without many family or friends, people who wouldn't be missed much. They would come to church one Sunday and never be seen again. Emmanuel tried not to think about what happened to them in the deep chambers beneath the Ikoyi building. He told himself they were necessary sacrifices for the greater good. But sometimes, late at night in his big new house, he could hear their voices in his dreams. Dr. James visited more often now, usually late at night. He would sit in Emmanuel's office, drinking expensive whiskey, his multiple bracelets clicking against the glass. Sometimes, when he had drunk too much, he would talk about his own first sacrifices, his voice heavy with memories he couldn't forget. "It gets easier," Dr. James would say, not sounding like he believed it himself. "The entity, it needs what it needs. We just follow the rules." Emmanuel's rise looked amazing from the outside. Within 3 years, Divine Light Assembly had moved from the old warehouse to a huge church complex with air conditioning and marble floors. Emmanuel wore designer suits now, drove a gold-plated G-Wagon, and lived in a mansion in Lekki Phase 1. His miracle shows got bigger and more spectacular. He would heal dozens of people at once, prophesy about people's futures, even claim to raise the dead. The crowds got bigger every week, filling the huge church and spilling out into the parking lot. But the price kept getting higher. more people disappeared. Strange accidents happened to those who asked too many questions. The entity's hunger seemed endless, and each sacrifice only made it want more. Emmanuel started having trouble sleeping. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his bracelet burning hot against his skin. Sometimes he thought he could hear whispers in his empty house, voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. Brother Solomon noticed the changes in Emmanuel. During their training sessions, he saw how Emmanuel's hands shook slightly, how his eyes darted around like he was always expecting something bad to happen. Power changes you, Solomon told him during one session. The question is, are you controlling it, or is it controlling you? But Emmanuel couldn't stop. The circle's demands kept coming, and the entity's hunger kept growing. Success had become a trap, and the bracelet that had once felt like a gift now felt like a chain around his wrist. Grace started noticing small things first. How Emmanuel always wore long sleeves, even in Lagos's hot weather. How he would touch his wrist during miracles, just before they happened. How people who questioned him too much seemed to stop coming to church. She kept a secret notebook, writing down everything strange she saw. Late at night, after everyone had left the church office, she would look through church records, trying to connect the dots. The patterns were there if you knew where to look. One night, while working late, Grace heard voices coming from Emmanuel's office. She crept closer to listen. Through the door, she could hear Emmanuel talking with Dr. James. The entity needs more, Dr. James was saying, his voice slurred from drinking. That last miracle show, it wasn't pleased with the small sacrifices anymore. But 3 people in 1 week? Emmanuel's voice sounded scared. People will start noticing. Then we'll make sure they don't notice. Sister Agnes has already picked the next ones, no family, no connections. Easy to make disappear. Grace's hand flew to her mouth to stop herself from gasping. She wrote everything in her notebook, her hands shaking. But she didn't know she wasn't the only one watching. Grace's investigation got deeper. She started following leads outside the church. In the Lagos State Library, she found old newspapers with stories about missing people, cases that lined up perfectly with Divine Light Assembly's biggest miracle shows. She discovered more. Chief Adenuga's name appeared in university records from 30 years ago, then suddenly disappeared. Dr. James owned businesses all over Lagos, but when she looked closer, they all seemed to be empty shells hiding something else. The breakthrough came when she found an old woman who used to clean the Ikoyi building. The woman was scared to talk at first, but finally told Grace about strange lights she'd seen at night, about screams coming from underground, about people going in, but never coming out. Grace kept her discoveries in a locked drawer in her office. She didn't know that Sister Agnes sometimes watched her through the windows at night, deciding whether to mark her as the next sacrifice. It happened during what should have been Emmanuel's biggest miracle yet. A young boy had died, and his rich parents brought him to Divine Light Assembly. Emmanuel promised to bring him back to life, something he'd never tried before. The church was packed. TV cameras were there to record everything. Emmanuel felt the bracelet burning against his skin as he approached the small coffin. But something was different this time. When he touched the boy's body, the entity's power felt wrong. Instead of the usual warm flow, it felt cold and hungry. Emmanuel saw something in that moment, a glimpse of what really powered his miracles. He saw the darkness beneath everything, the true cost of his power. Grace was watching from the side, recording everything on her phone. She saw how Emmanuel's bracelet glowed red before the miracle. She saw the strange shadows that moved around the room. Most importantly, she saw the look of pure horror on Emmanuel's face when the boy sat up. Because the boy did sit up. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes of a child anymore. For just a moment, something else looked out through those eyes, something ancient and hungry. That night, after everyone had left, Grace finally confronted Emmanuel. The night Grace confronted Emmanuel, everything changed. She walked into his office without knocking, carrying a thick folder full of evidence. The security cameras were all turned off, Brother Solomon's silent way of helping, though Grace didn't know it then. "What are you really doing here?" Grace asked, dropping the folder on his desk. Pictures spilled out, secret meetings, strange rituals, people who had disappeared. What happens to the people who vanish after your miracles? Emmanuel felt the bracelet grow hot on his wrist. Part of him wanted to use its power on Grace, make her forget everything. But he was tired of the lies, tired of the darkness, tired of the entity's endless hunger. "You don't understand," he said, his voice heavy. "The circle, the power has a price. Everything has a price." "Show me," Grace demanded. "Show me what's really behind all this." Without thinking, Emmanuel rolled up his sleeve. The bracelet glowed angry red in the dark office, casting strange shadows on the walls. Grace recorded everything on her phone, the unnatural light, the way the shadows moved wrong, the fear in Emmanuel's voice as he started talking. He told her everything, about the circle, about the entity, about the sacrifices. Once he started, he couldn't stop. It was like poison flowing out of him, years of secrets finally being told. What they didn't know was that Sister Agnes was watching through the window, her own bracelets glowing with warning. She sent urgent messages to the other circle members, their greatest secret was about to be exposed. Grace's evidence spread fast. She had already sent copies to news stations and posted videos online. By morning, the whole city was talking about it. The video showed Emmanuel's glowing bracelet, caught shadows moving in impossible ways, revealed the truth behind the miracles. The circle called an emergency meeting in their underground chamber. Chief Adenuga sat in his ancient chair, looking older than ever. Dr. James paced the room, his multiple bracelets clicking together nervously. Sister Agnes stood in the shadows, already planning how to contain the damage. "The entity is disturbed," Chief Adenuga announced, feeling the power pulse through his own bracelet. "This exposure, it threatens everything." In his mansion, Emmanuel watched his world crumble. News vans parked outside his gate. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Church members demanded answers. But worst of all was the feeling from his bracelet, a burning, angry sensation that told him the entity wasn't pleased. Brother Solomon visited him that night, slipping past the reporters easily with his military training. "The circle will survive this," he said, looking at Emmanuel with something like pity. "We always survive. The question is, will you?" Grace worked through the night in her office, organizing her evidence, answering calls from journalists. She knew she was in danger. Sister Agnes had already tried to send people to talk to her. But she had planned for this, spreading her evidence so widely that stopping her wouldn't matter anymore. By Sunday, the church was surrounded by crowds, not worshippers this time, but angry people demanding answers. Police cars lined the streets. News helicopters circled overhead. But inside his office, Emmanuel faced a different kind of pressure. The bracelet burned hotter than ever. He could feel the entity's anger, its hunger for revenge. The circle had taught him that exposure meant death, but now he wondered if death might be better than what the entity had planned for him. The stage was set for everything to explode. Grace had the truth. The circle had its power. And Emmanuel? He stood in the middle, wearing a bracelet that felt more like a shackle, waiting to see which would be stronger, the truth Grace had exposed or the ancient power that had given him everything. The exposure of Emmanuel and Divine Light Assembly sent shockwaves through Lagos and beyond. TV stations couldn't stop talking about it. Social media was full of videos showing Emmanuel's powers failing. But while everyone focused on the scandal at the church, the Crimson Circle was making plans in the shadows. Deep in their underground chamber, Chief Adenuga called an emergency meeting. The old leaders gathered around, Dr. James with his multiple bracelets, Sister Agnes looking worried, Brother Solomon standing guard, and Madam Sarah writing everything in her journal. "The entity is angry," Chief Adenuga said, his voice low and serious. "But we have survived worse storms in our centuries of existence." Brother Solomon stepped forward, his bracelets glowing softly in the dim light. "What should we do, Chief?" "The police will start asking questions soon." Chief Adenuga with a serious look that showed why he had led the circle for so long. "We do what we have always done when danger comes. We vanish into the shadows, let the storm pass over us. We have safe houses around the world, connections in places the authorities can't reach. Sister Agnes nodded slowly. And the other members? Tell them to lay low, Chief Adenuga ordered. Continue their normal lives, but no more public displays of power. No miracles, no shows of wealth. We must become invisible until the right time comes. Brother Solomon, thinking like the military man he was, already had a plan. I'll activate our emergency protocols. We have enough money in our hidden accounts to keep everyone comfortable for years. Madame Sarah holding her journal. And Emmanuel? He served his purpose, Chief Adenuga said coldly. Let him face the consequences alone. The Circle protects its secrets, not its tools. That night, the Crimson Circle began its disappearing act. Members melted away into the shadows of Lagos and beyond. Chief Adenuga himself vanished to a secret compound in a remote part of the country, where the entity's power was said to be strongest. Dr. James flew to Dubai, where another branch of the Circle waited. Sister Agnes moved to London, hiding among the city's millions. Brother Solomon went underground in South Africa, keeping watch over the Circle's African operations. Madame Sarah took her precious journals to a monastery in Ethiopia, where ancient secrets had been kept safe for centuries. The police found nothing when they finally raided the Circle's headquarters, just empty rooms and cold candles. The power of the bracelets lived on, hidden but not weakened. In dark corners of Lagos, people still whispered about the Crimson Circle. Some said they were gone forever. Others claimed to see people wearing red bracelets in expensive cars late at night. The truth was, the Circle was doing what it had always done best, waiting in the shadows, gathering power, and planning its return. The entity's hunger would need to be fed again, and when the time was right, the Circle would rise once more. 5 years later, in a luxury penthouse in Dubai, Dr. James sat watching the Lagos news on his TV. The Divine Light Assembly scandal had faded from memory, replaced by newer scandals and stories. His phone buzzed, a message from Chief Adenuga, the time is coming. Prepare the bracelets. Dr. James smiled, touching his multiple bracelets. They felt warm against his skin, pulsing with power that had only grown stronger in hiding. Soon, very soon, the Crimson Circle would write its next chapter. But that would be a different story. In her office at the community center that was once Emmanuel's church, Grace kept working to help people. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she saw red glows in dark corners, felt the weight of unseen eyes watching. Deep down, she knew the truth, the Circle wasn't gone. They were just waiting, gathering strength for whatever would come next.